There's nothing I love more than authenticity, which is why I'm so excited about Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce, which has been on kitchen tables in Mexico since 1956. It will be available here in the US for purchase later this year. In addition to livening up your food, it's Mexican-owned, it's woman-owned, and it's one of the only hot sauce brands to have 100% Mexican-sourced pepper mix. Salsa de la Viuda hot sauce will be available here in the United States to purchase on shelves later this year. Hey there, I'm Lezli Levine-Harvell. Welcome to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. I believe the best way to explore a topic in depth is to view it through multiple lenses. Join us as we explore race, culture, and societal issues through the lens of industry experts, writers, cultural critics, and HBCU students. We're closing out our topic, Hamburgers and hot dogs are German, you know that, right? With the two-part episode. We've been exploring the word ethnic as coded language, immigration, and who gets to be American. We kicked off 4 weeks ago, so if you have not listened to those previous episodes, please go back and listen because they're central to today's conversation, and plus, they're fire. So please go back and take a listen. It'll help contextualize things for you. So during part 1 of today's conversation, we're going to continue to explore what we've chatted about over the past month. We're going to talk about how it coalesces and manifests itself in mainstream culture. I'm so excited to explore this with Tyler Phillips, marketing phenom and also very fabulous too. She is the director of cultural and lifestyle partnerships at Bacardi, where she builds and maintains brand national relationships with celebrities, influencers, and entertainment organizations. As a matter of fact, she was just with Meek Mill in Lisbon. Is that right?
Yes, we were filming a video and commercial for our campaign for next year.
Look at you all fabulous. Tyler joined Bacardi in 2010, where she previously managed the Roc Nation partnership and marketing for Douce Cognac. And before joining Bacardi, Tyler led African American marketing for Heineken USA. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So excited for this.
I am so excited. And you have that fresh, off-the-plane Lisbon tan.
I tried. I did my best.
And really, who better to have this conversation with than you? Your work is so deeply embedded in culture and in marketing. So we've pretty much established over the past month that the contemporary use of the word ethnic is used to describe immigrants of color and aspects of their culture, such as their food and their ingredients. And doing this places whiteness as the default. Ethnic is a race-specific term that disguises itself as a race-neutral term, which is how coded language functions. We know the way words are used often have real consequences. For example, the notion that natural hair is unprofessional. It's race-neutral language, but it targets Black people, specifically Black women. According to a study conducted, and you may know this, a study conducted by the Dove Crown Coalition, Black women are 1.5 times more likely to be sent home from their workplace because of their hair. And, obviously legislation literally had to be passed to prevent racial-based hair discrimination. California was the first to do so in 2019 with the Crown Act, and similar legislation has been passed in 7 states since then. One of the other things we discussed, or that I discussed in previous episodes, is I remember the specific time that I came to understand ethnic as something different than its Merriam-Webster definition. And the same goes for the word urban. I remember learning in elementary school what rural, urban, and suburban meant, right? You remember that.
Right. Yeah.
I also remember the first time I heard someone use it to be synonymous with low class. And I remember thinking that it was completely opposite of how I understood the word urban, because growing up in Mount Vernon, to me, the city, the urban area meant Manhattan. It meant fabulousness. It meant Wall Street. It meant Fifth Avenue.
City life.
Exactly. And so over time, I realized that its common use, obviously just through conversations and people using it, it didn't just mean low class, it meant Black and low class. So, it had this connotative power.
Inner city.
Right, which was another coded term.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up inner city. So there's an article that was published in July by the Brookings Institution by two Metropolitan Policy Fellows, Jennifer Bay and Hannah Love. They say language about place matters because it can be used to justify actions taken towards people. The United States has had a long history of using coded language about place to justify policy and practice decisions that impact people. Take the term blight, for example, which transposes the language of disease onto place. It was used to justify numerous racial injustices throughout the 20th century, including urban renewal, eminent domain, and the displacement of thousands of Black families. One of the things I've always found problematic as it relates to linguistic choices, specifically as it relates to food-focused writing, is when food is referred to, or a dish is referred to, an elevated version of something else. So, for example, when there is a, traditional dish and it's referred to as, oh, this is an elevated version of this dish. And I've actually never heard French food or Italian food described in this way. No one says elevated French food or elevated Italian food. It's primarily used to describe cuisine that is associated with a culture that's racialized. So Tyler, as a senior level marketing executive who is deeply intertwined in culture, what are some of the insidious ways in which you've seen coded language manifest itself, not just in the beverage industry, but across the broader cultural landscape? And if you can you draw any correlation between that coded language and the cumulative impact?
Sure. I think for us, having been a marketer at this point for almost 15 years, always either in beauty or spirits industries, it's really something that is a hot topic, if you will. I've also almost always specialized in either multicultural marketing, which is going to be the word that I would classify as kind of the topic for today for me, either multicultural, African American, or now I'm in lifestyle and cultural marketing, which ironically feels like the first time that it's actually properly named. Because the reality is that multicultural, probably previously urban, before that, I think urban is probably as far as derogatory as we've been in terms of how the job is described or how our target market is described. But they've always been targeting really the epicenter of culture, the epicenter of popular culture, but coded in a way that makes it like we're only targeting Black people. But the reality is we're targeting Black people with the hopes of what we target them to emanate to all of the cultures which are heavily influenced by them. Multicultural, though, I'd say has been, at least for my industry and in my experience, kind of that title that has been the collect-all, if you will, of minority cultures that I think has done the biggest disservice to us, because within corporate walls, it does become a way to just generalize marketing to a certain audience that we know as Black consumers, we're not all the same, for one. And there's so many segments within a race, within a culture that are important and make up Black culture as it is.
There's something that you said that was really interesting. You said that there's language that's used to target popular culture, but at the same time, the nomenclature refers to it as if it's somehow minoritized or it's a subculture. I've always found that so interesting, this language around calling people or their culture a subculture, even though it's popular culture. I think for you, who is in this space, you probably find that frustrating.
It definitely is. And I think the other side of that, right, is that white people are called the general market. And that's also a misnomer because they're not the general market, Again, it requires you as the marketer to have that almost sixth sense around really understanding who you're targeting and not just taking the label of something as general market or multicultural and just leaving it at that, but really understanding who is the audience and who makes up that audience. Like, what are they made of? I have been in multicultural marketing, but I've also been in general market marketing. So my first job actually at L'Oreal, I was marketing perms, but for white people. So,
okay.
My target market was basically like a 60, 70 plus white woman. And I took it personally as my job as a marketer to make sure that even though I didn't know many women in that demo, to make sure that I thoroughly knew my target. And that's the same onus that we have to put on marketers today, because there is no general market. There is no even purely Black market, right? It's important that everyone do that due diligence. And I couldn't, even at that time, say, look, I don't know anybody like this. I can't possibly market to them, or make some huge mistake and market to them in a tone or tonality that they would miss.
I've also always been fascinated by the word urban in marketing and in culture. For example, I do think there are some entities who use it properly. For example, in New York, the Urbanworld Film Festival, which takes place annually, and it uses the word urban to signify what's cutting edge and what's going on from a metropolitan standpoint globally. However, you and I both know that that's not actually the most common use. It's become sort of like a stand-in for Black. And to your point, it erases the diversity of the Black experience. There was a 2018 article published by The Guardian. The writer Kahindi Andrews says, Motown is inseparable from Detroit. The East Coast-West Coast beef was just as much about the sounds of Los Angeles and New York as the personalities. But urban is not used to represent all the music from the city, such as punk and contemporary Asian music. Those musics are not included in urban music. And did you hear that the Grammys are going to be tweaking their language for 2021? I don't know if you've heard that. Yeah. So they're going to be tweaking that language. I've also read that Warner Music Group plans to stop using the term urban to refer to music by Black artists. And iHeartMedia, the largest radio company in the US, plans to phase out urban, and they're going to use hip hop and R&B instead. So it looks like there's sort of a general consensus that we're letting the term urban die.
That's good.
What are some cringy and coded language practices from your point of view as a marketing professional that we really need to just let die, as we're seeing with the use of the word urban across the cultural landscape?
The one that comes to mind first, which is going to be super relevant for me, but maybe not so much for you or your listeners. For a long time in our industry, we had bulletproof stores, which if you can think about any liquor store that you've been in the inner city and how they have the plexiglass all around them. And I think it's really interesting how now, almost every account and business has that now, right? Because they're protecting themselves from COVID, but nobody's talking about it being bulletproof. That was one for me in our industry that always, they've started to try and find new nomenclature for it, but that is one that's a struggle for me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I want to talk to you about looking at coded language through a different lens. Obviously, Black people throughout the diaspora have had a very, very complicated history with bourbon, rum, and whiskey. Looking at rum specifically, in his book, Rum Curious, Fred Minnick says, the sugarcane industry was made possible by slavery. He uses the word slaves, but I'm going to say enslaved Africans. Enslaved Africans planted the sugarcane, fertilized it, cut stalks, and transported it to a mill where the cane was crushed and juice extracted. They strained the juice and placed it in boiling pots until the sugar was crystallized. Enslaved Africans also sinned the boiling water to collect molasses. Enslaved people may have even developed the rum-making process. Fermented molasses was enjoyed by the enslaved Africans and by poor whites. And at some point, somebody sold these fermented molasses and rum was born. I'm just trying to create imagery for you of enslaved Africans in the heat harvesting sugarcane. And I want to read something else to you too. I want to read a tour description to you, and this tour is offered on a plantation in Nashville. And I know it's a plantation because plantation is in the name of the property and it's also in the name of the website. Over 150 years ago, Blankety Blank Spirits was born on the outskirts of one of the nation's premier thoroughbred horse farms. Today, we invite you to join us in our reconstructed 1820s ice house for an exclusive opportunity. Unlike any other distillery, tasting, or bar venue, this hour-long program is limited to a small audience to guarantee a secluded and relaxed experience. Let our storytellers walk you through the history of whiskey and bourbon from the time of Revolution through Prohibition, while sipping on many cocktails. So, coded language always signifies something. It's always racially targeted, just disguised as something else that's racially neutral. When a spirits company or just any company has plantation in the name or that old-timey imagery of what's clearly supposed to be a plantation, would you consider this coded language or imagery? And if so, what are they signifying?
I would definitely consider it coded language. I think for the same reasons that a lot of that post George Floyd is being changed and eradicated. We know what they meant. They know what they meant. And it all needs to go, right? So I think that there is a level of historical accuracy that I think is, I work for Bacardi, which is a family-owned business. It's been family-owned since it was started. They are very proud of their legacy and how they've always made rum and et cetera, et cetera. You know, Uncle Nearest, right, which is coming out now in terms of its history with Jack Daniels. And I think that there is an opportunity to write the story. You can't change what happened.
Right.
And I think there's room to explain what happened without romanticizing it. And for the Bacardi family, that exists as well, because they were exiled from Cuba. Things were stolen from them. There's a long history from them that they are very passionate about telling at least their side of the story. I think the unfortunate part is that we as Black people haven't really had a platform to tell our side of the story, if we even know it. The only part of the story that's been told is the ones that are still alive today, reaping the rewards of that work. And we don't necessarily have it. We know what they intend to say. I do think that the time is now for some of those businesses to really decide what they want to stand for today and to write the story going forward. And now is the opportunity to do that.
I really consider you a leader in the industry. What are some specific ways that brands and media outlets can stop othering Black and Indigenous folks and people of color?
It really is about giving a voice and a platform to a more diverse storytellers. We've been telling our story. We've been telling the brand story. It's time for that mic to be passed to people who haven't had a voice. And that's at least on Bacardi's side, what we're trying to do. And everything that we do is amplify the voices of the unheard. Because again, it's everyone's individual perspective. It's not to say what's right or wrong, but if only one version of a story has been told, then we don't have the truth yet.
Okay, so this is my last question, and it's a fun one. As you know, this podcast is curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience, and this is a question that we ask all of our guests. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
So my favorite restaurant of all time is Crustaceans, the original Crustaceans, which is in San Francisco across from Golden Gate Park. It's amazing. So they really are known for their noodles, their drunken noodles, and they have a drunken crab. It's so good. Have you been there?
No, but it's going to be on my post-pandemic list.
More impolite conversation in just a moment. HBO's latest documentary, Stockton on My Mind, is the multi-layered story of millennial mayor Michael Tubbs, whose own experience growing up in poverty and violence inspired him to create innovative change in his hometown of Stockton, California. Becoming the city's youngest and first African-American mayor, the film follows Tubbs as he defies expectations and makes efforts to reverse the fortunes of a city known as one of the poorest, most violent, and least literate in the nation. Directed by Emmy winner Mark Levin, stream it now on HBO Max. Visit hbomax.com to sign up for your 7-day free trial.
The drama Farewell Amor made its world premiere in competition at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. It tells the story of an Angolan immigrant who is separated for 17 years by visa struggles and is united in Brooklyn with his wife and daughter. They're strangers sharing a one-bedroom apartment, and they discover a shared love of dance that may help them overcome the distance between them. I'm so excited to chat with the director of this film today, Ekwa Msangi, who is a Tanzanian-American filmmaker who has written and directed for television and film. Msangi has been awarded the Tribeca Institute and Sundance Institute fellowships, as well as the Jerome Foundation Grant, which is a fellowship for emerging artists who create bold, innovative, and risk-taking new work that explores and challenges conventional artistic forms. Her feature directorial debut, Farewell Amor, is an official selection at the Urbanworld Film Festival, which begins this Wednesday. Hi, Ekwa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
And what city are you in?
I'm currently in Nairobi, in Kenya.
Congrats on Farewell Amor being the belle of the ball at Sundance.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're really excited about it.
So, over the past 4 weeks, we've chatted about ethnic as coded language and how it others immigrants of color, as well as places the Western lens and whiteness as the normative view through which to view things, whether it's food, history, architecture, film. You were born in Oakland, and your parents were Fulbright scholars that migrated to the US from Tanzania to study at Stanford.
Right.
When you were 5 years old, you returned to East Africa, to Kenya. Did you see yourself reflected in movies and television there?
Oh my goodness. Never. Not in the least. Not even a little bit. No. I think it wasn't until the 90s where CNN started, and then it was just images of war. The war in Iraq was the whole point of introducing CNN, anyways. So there wasn't anything on TV for sure. Later on in the 90s, we got mostly British programming, British TV soap operas or shows. All the local theaters up until I think 80s, probably mid 90s, were owned either by Fox, American owned, or the local businessmen who owned were Indian people from the continent, from India. So they would either show Hollywood blockbusters or Indian sort of blockbusters, not even Bollywood films, because I don't think Bollywood was really that big then, but a lot of sort of religious programming. So there really wasn't any space for us other than news. That's where we saw ourselves reflected, and maybe a few sort of TV magazine type programs, but there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing, and that was upsetting.
Was that your impetus to become a storyteller?
For sure, because I already was an immigrant living in Kenya. My family's from Tanzania. At that time, after the breaking of the first East Africa Union, a lot of attitudes towards foreigners here, there was a lot of xenophobia. It was sort of like, oh, you're coming here to take our jobs. There wasn't sort of, at least in my parents' time, where it was considered like a unity and we're all building the continent together and things like that. That's not what I came into when I moved to Kenya. And so my understanding of my own culture and my own people was through these stories that relatives would come and visit us, would come and tell and talk about cousin so-and-so and what happened with this one and that one. And they were just always so colorful. I mean, even just the way that language is used is always so colorful and, would paint these really vivid pictures of what was happening and who it was happening to. And that was something that was never reflected anywhere in media for me, other than sort of war and strife. And, when we moved back here, that was right during the time of We Are the World. So that was the image of just like starvation, struggle, strife, war, etc. And it was just like, that's not the people that I know.
That's not your lived experience.
Absolutely not. And when I try to explain it to people, because, in some settings, I sound American. So a lot of people forget that I'm an immigrant in the States. And so they'll say things to me like, oh, well, remember such and such show. And it's like, well, first of all, I never grew up with that because I didn't live in the States as a young person. But also, you can see how dear a lot of these programs are to American people. That's what people grew up on. That was their understanding of their world and their life and what it meant to be a teenager and what it meant to go to the prom or, whatever big things there were in American life. I know what the big things are in American life because our books and our movies and our TV shows and blah, blah, blah were all American or British. But I don't know what those are for us. We don't know what that is for us because that was never a discussion. It was always very outward facing. And so I try to explain it to American friends as though if you think of your favorite show, The Brady Bunch or A Different World or whatever it is, fill in the blank, but then everybody on the show is like Scandinavian or something and speaking a Scandinavian language. And that is your whole understanding of the world is through the lens of Scandinavian people or Chinese people, whoever, fill in the blank, but through another culture. That's actually damaging. I actually do think that is damaging to one's psyche to never understand yourself through your own lived experience. I did go to Kenyan system school, so we did have African literature, but a lot of the literature came sort of out of the 60s and the 70s, so it also had a certain date to it.
Even when you say that you're talking to like your American friends about these shows that are sort of near and dear to them, and hearing you talk about not seeing yourself reflected, you're talking about my experience here in New York, like growing up in New York in the 80s, right? I'm 42. I was born in 78, so I'm very much, for all intents and purposes, a child of the 80s. I also think even with that, it also tells a very narrow view. It tells a very specific American story.
Right. I mean, we had the Cosby Show at one point. I think Webster's
adopted by white parents, right?
Right. And his whole thing is like, he's just this cute little boy, and
he's like a caricature of something. He's like this Black boy who never grows up, so therefore he's cute.
Exactly. And similar with different strokes with the Arnold character, who also pretty much remained this little for the whole show and was just kind of he had these little punchlines and what you talking about, man, and whatever it was.
And also adopted by
white people.
The mom was his housekeeper.
Right, exactly. What is that message about aspiration? Is like, are we all supposed to aspire to be adopted by some white people? Like, is that our future? On the flip side, what was it? The show with JJ.
Oh, Good Times. Yes, they're living in the projects.
That's a family unit, an intact family unit that haven't been adopted by white people, but where are they living and what kind of life do they live? So those are the two options. And it's just like, wow, it's kind of rough. But everything else, 90210, and all sort of happy white people living their fabulous lives in Beverly Hills. And like their biggest concern is like, does he have a crush on me? Does he not? Am I going to go to the prom? Am I not?
2 weeks ago, we chatted with two Nigerian students who immigrated here for college specifically, and they attend HBCUs. And we were talking to them about their international experience, but we were also talking to them about what sorts of shows and things like that they see. And the images that they were seeing on the continent in Nigeria is a very sort of singular image of what it means to be a Black American. On the flip side, my daughter made the point of what you see in the United States as it relates to being African are two things. You are either poverty-stricken, you're wearing animal skins, you're riding a lion to school, or you are like royalty, or you are a scammer. You have a lot of money, but you're a scammer. There's no in between. In our last two episodes, we talk about how academia reinforces that certain subjects are canon and other topics are optional. You attended NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, and you said you found it challenging as a filmmaker getting people to understand the African aesthetic. Can you share what those challenges were, and do you share that sentiment about academia?
I have such a love-hate relationship with academia because I teach as well. I got to NYU 98, so end of the 90s. This was pre-digital, pre-YouTube. Now we're able to access a whole lot more than what we were able to see back then. Unless you went to a very sort of niche, specialized film festival, nobody ever saw African film. So the only idea that any of my peers, any of my teachers had was what Hollywood puts out or had put out at that time, which was very limited. So when I came with my stories, I would constantly get confronted with like, no, that's not how it happens. No, that's not true. We've never seen that story. And so therefore...
You're like, I'm sorry, this is my lived experience. What do you mean this isn't true? Oh, I actually know people like this.
As a filmmaker, that's been a huge challenge for me in terms of the stories that I want to tell. Because again, my storytelling comes out of my family. I have an enormous family. I could literally spend the rest of my career just telling stories about my family and I'd be good. I remember doing a project, and it was just a very basic project with sort of pictures of African women from across the continent. And the feedback was like, there are no African women that look like that because they were lighter skinned women. And I was like, but this is what my family looks like. And they were like, no, we've never seen that. Therefore, we can't believe it. Therefore, it's not legitimate. Nobody's going to buy into this.
And you get an F.
Yeah. Literally by the time I finished college, like my fourth year, I was this close to quitting because I just didn't see any space for me. And it wasn't until my final year, my fourth year, when one of the professors in Africana Studies department gave a class on the history of African cinema, which I'd never heard of or seen any of these films or filmmakers before. So it was mind-blowing, to find that there was a bunch of people who had already been doing this, because I had kind of thought I was like the first one. and B, that they had been saying really complicated things for all of this time. And it completely shifted my gaze to just be like, oh, I'm just speaking to the wrong audience. I have been trying to explain myself to a room of white people who already have a very limited view of who I am and what I could possibly be.
So that class helped you find your voice as a director?
Absolutely, 100%. It was a huge game changer for me. And then I decided to study African cinema. So I did a master's degree. I studied African cinema so I would know who came before me and understand what was there, what was the landscape, so that I could then embark on, okay, how do I insert myself? What is it that I have to contribute to this story that's already being told in a number of different ways, in a number of different languages too?
So in your film, Farewell Amor, you use kizomba. Is it kizomba?
Yes, kizomba.
Kizomba, which is a dance as a metaphor. First, can you explain what kizomba is and why you chose dance as a narrative device?
Yeah, kizomba is beautiful. Kizomba is a couples dance from Angola, similar in stance as, a salsa or bachata in terms of two people sort of embracing each other and facing each other, but different in the sense that it doesn't have a regular foot pattern. When I dance to salsa, your leader is kind of indicating which direction to go, but your foot pattern is doing the same thing over and over again. So your job as the follower is just to keep the beat, keep the same foot pattern over and over again. Kizomba is not like that. It requires you to be connected to your partner in a certain way because he's just dancing to the music and how he feels and how he's interpreting the song. And so the dance and the song are very important. There's a certain connection that you have to have with your partner in order to be able to sort of move on a dime and understand which direction he wants you to go, if he wants you to slow down, if he wants you to speed up or whatever. And I just thought that was such an interesting metaphor for relationship. What happens when you're not in connection with your partner? Therefore, you can't follow or you can't lead because you're both listening to the same song, but your interpretation of the song is different unless you're in sync. The story itself is inspired by a relationship in my family of my aunt and my uncle and their struggles to reunite after several years, 20 plus years actually, till today. They got married in the 90s. Uncle left, I think around 96 or so. He got a student visa in the US, came over to the US with every intention of bringing auntie and cousin. At that time, their son was, I think, 5 months old when he left. And till today, 2020, are still struggling to reconnect, to have auntie come over. And that's shaped their entire life. So the story is inspired by, well, what if auntie got her visa? What would happen? And then I wanted to add this element of dance as sort of this metaphor of what happens when you're disconnected from your dance partner, or in this case, your love partner, your life partner. How do you find your rhythm again, so to speak?
Also, to your point about in the United States, not necessarily having a lot of depictions of East Africans, you get to showcase diversity in African music. I would say generally here in the United States, West African music is a lot more popular.
Absolutely.
And in your film, Southern African, specifically Congolese and Angolan music is showcased.
Yeah. And which was very deliberate for me. Having grown up in East Africa, Tanzania borders Congo. So I grew up on Congolese music, which is huge. Congolese music is actually enormous and has been huge way longer than any of this West African music has, including Fela. Though I love a lot of Afrobeat and I love Fela as well. No shade to anybody. But if you go to Europe, people are well more familiar with Congolese music and it's epic.
Wait, I'm asking you right now. I need to know who are like the top. I'm like, as soon as I finish with you, I'm going to stream some right now. Top 4.
Yuri da Cunha is wonderful. Some of the musicians that we use in our film, Kiaku Kiadaf, is beautiful. C4 Pedro, he's sort of slightly more hip hop, just beautiful dance music. And they dance, like men dance. That's an actual regular thing. I spent a lot of time doing a lot of Angolan dance, and they literally use all parts of their body to dance. I really wanted to feature that. So even in terms of casting, I was very specific about, I don't speak Portuguese. I've never been to Angola, But I did do a lot of research, and certainly for the film, wanted to be very specific about how they sounded, what their accents were like, what kind of music we were listening to, and also, again, trying to pull apart the continent, because we tend to get lumped together. Africa is enormous, the continent, and our histories are very, very vast and very, very different. And very few people know, that Angola went through like a 30-year civil war. And especially being in America and how Americans talk about the Cold War, the Russians, the Cold War. The Cold War was fought on the African continent. Another thing that very few people actually know, there wasn't bombs dropping in the US. Those bombs were dropping in Angola because it was American. They were supporting one faction, and then the Cubans and the Russians were supporting another faction, and those people were fighting, and therefore we have a 30-year war that took place on the African continent. And what does that do to people, and what kind of effect does that have on people's lives? It's a lot easier when we're talking about wars that take place over there. Right now it's Iraq and Syria and all these places, and the war and all the things that we have to do with the war. But if it's not actually what's happening to those people who's having bombs dropped on their heads, and that's something that I think America doesn't do a very good job of really paying attention to.
I love that your film is creating other narratives. One of the things that we've been exploring over the past month is not just ethnic as coded language, but what it means to be an American and who gets to be American.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I think that films like yours are so important because it is about redefining the paradigm and shifting it in terms of who is American. And the story that you're telling that was based on your uncle is the story of Americans. It is an all-American story. I'm so excited about your film and to see it
Thank you.
this week at Urbanworld Film Festival. And I have
you.
one last question. It's a fun one. We ask all our guests. It's your last night on Earth. Where are you eating?
I am thinking about this little shack that I visited on the beach in Zanzibar some years ago. It was just one of these places where it's a fisherman who also is like a badass cook. And so he takes your order, like, what kind of seafood do you want? And then he'll go out and get it. So it was like a candlelit dinner because there was no electricity on this shack that was literally like you walk over there and there's the water. And he brought in the catch of the day. He took our orders in the morning, asked us what we wanted, and then went out and got the fish and brought it back. This is Zanzibar, so it's East African cuisine, which just has all of the spices, all of the cardamoms and the coconuts and the cinnamons. And Zanzibar is a spice town, we grow spices. So it's all fresh spices as well. Like he literally went, climbed the tree, took the whatever, and had this beautiful curried octopus and coconut rice and, whatever vegetables there were at the time. I think I would do well with some Zanzibari food.
I would do well with that too.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Impolite Conversation, the podcast, curated by the Iconoclast Dinner Experience. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Icon Dinner and on the Iconoclast Dinner Experience Facebook page. Let us know what you thought about this episode. Hit us on socials or send us feedback at press@iconoclastdinner.com. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our podcast, and we'd also love it if you rated and reviewed us.